Well, good evening. Welcome to Widcombe Baptist Church and welcome to our event tonight, which is called Beating Death, Is There Hope Beyond the Grave? We're thinking particularly tonight about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which really helps us to answer that question. My name is Tom, and I've got Paul and Clover with me here, and Lexi will be joining us in just a short time. We'll introduce you guys in a minute, but first to say that throughout tonight, there's going to be a number on screen. If you've got questions you'd like to ask us, please text that number or WhatsApp it. And if you're watching at home on YouTube, you can also put your questions in the chat function there. And we'll try and get to those in about 15 minutes time, and then also towards the end of the night. It's worth me saying that we're being quite ambitious with what we're tackling tonight. We're going to talk both about the evidence and the claims of the resurrection, and also how that affects and changes our life tonight. So we hope you can follow along with us. We just wanted to let you know that we're thinking about quite a few things. But first, Paul and Clover, could you just introduce yourselves to us? Tell us a bit about you and about what you do. And Clover, particularly, why don't you tell us about your previous employment? I think that's helpful to us tonight.
So yes, my name's Clover. I'm one of the pastors here at the church with Paul, which I've been doing since 2014. But before that, I worked for 18 years in the law. When you say that, people often think that you would have done criminal law. I've no experience with that at all. I did civil law, dealing with cases where people are injured or have industrial diseases. But the relevance this evening, I guess, is that I have a keen interest in evidence, what can be proved, what can be shown, and I'm particularly interested in documentary evidence. Lawyers love bits of paper, and I'm a lawyer. I love bits of paper.
Sounds boring. No, it doesn't. I'm Paul, and I've had the great privilege of working with Clover for the last 7 years. In fact, I've been here in Bath for about that period of time. I've actually been a Christian minister, a pastor for almost 40 years now, and before that for a very brief period of time as a teacher. And before that I studied theology, so really I guess for years and years been addressing the kind of issue of the truth claims of the Christian faith. Is it credible? Can you believe it? Or is it just a kind of, a shot in the dark?
Well, as we're thinking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I want to start off with some just kind of fairly straightforward questions. The first of which is, do you two believe in an actual real person called Jesus?
Yes.
Yeah, it kind of goes with the job, really, doesn't it? Yes, and I don't think there are many credible historians today who would doubt that a man called Jesus Christ lived in Palestine in the first century. The evidence is overwhelming of the reality of a real man, Jesus, and just the very fact that there is evidence of kind of a turning point in history, so that we have BC and AD, the way in which we even get our time and our dates, is evidence that there was someone who made a huge impact on the world. So, yep, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a real Jesus. Do you believe that he really died on a cross as recorded for us in the gospel accounts?
Again, yes.
Yeah, and again, yes, yeah. Two things. One is that he was crucified. That is beyond any shadow of doubt that he was crucified, because in the first century, crucifixion was kind of the most abominable thing that could happen to anybody. You want to destroy someone and their reputation, you get them crucified. So no one would ever have invented the idea that the founder of their religion had been nailed to a cross and hung up in public shame. So number one, definitely crucified. But then number two, he definitely died. People who are crucified don't walk away. The Romans are experts in death. When they kill you, you really are killed. And when they get to the point of checking Jesus out, the normal thing to do, just as a kind of an extra means of making sure that the person dies, is you just break their legs. You break their legs and the shock to the system just kills them. They come to Jesus and they're so convinced that he's dead, they don't need to break his legs. They put a spear in his side, out comes water and blood. He really, truly was dead. No question about that at all.
Okay, so we've got a dead Jesus. Do you believe that he actually and physically rose from the dead after that?
Again, yes. And this time, I will just add, I think it's very important to say as we go through this evening, that I believe that you can rigorously hold that belief. You know, sometimes it's portrayed as if those of us that believe in Jesus, you know, we're great thinkers up until the point when we talk about Jesus. And suddenly when it becomes that, we've binned our minds and we've just gone off on some weird tangent and actually we've stopped thinking. No, we would contend that actually thoughtful people who look at the evidence and think about it carefully conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. It is not about binning your mind off. It's not about ignoring facts. It is about looking at evidence.
Yep, nothing to add to that really. Absolutely that he rose physically from the dead. Yeah, I believe that.
Okay, so you two both, and I as well actually, agree that Jesus really rose from the dead. Now some people, some critics, would strongly disagree with that. They would say that it didn't really happen. The resurrection it's more a myth, a sort of a spiritual metaphor that helps us to understand life. What would you say to that?
Well, we all understand what we mean by a kind of a life-giving existential experience, don't we? So on Wednesday, my wife and I went and had our COVID injection. And for the first time, my wife has been very careful what she does and what she doesn't do. For the first time, we were able to go for a walk down by the river in Bath. And the sun was shining, and it felt like spring. And the what are those yellow things?
Daffodils.
Daffodils. The daffodils were kind of blowing in the breeze. And I said to her, "What do you feel like?" She said, "I feel alive." It was great. And you know, that we've all had that experience. Now it's kind of, feel good. And there have been people who say, well, that's all that happened as far as the early church was concerned. It was a kind of an existential experience. Jesus stayed in the tomb, but they kind of had somebody described an Easter faith, an Easter experience of just, this is wonderful. Well, I've got to say, to put that in technical terms, it's absolute garbage. You see, in the early church, in the first century, they understood the difference between life and death. They weren't stupid. C.S. Lewis once said that the problem is today we kind of look back on people with a kind of a chronological snobbery. We think we're very clever and they were just simpletons, and so they didn't understand anything. In the first century, people knew what death was, and they knew what resurrection was, and they knew the difference between someone who died and someone who was now alive, who stood in front of them, who they could touch. They knew that. They believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. If you'd said to them, oh no, your experience is just an existential experience, it's just a myth, they'd have looked at you, what are you talking about? We don't know, that's crazy. Their lives were turned upside down because they believed in a physical, bodily resurrection. To put it simply, when Jesus stood in front of them, he had new properties in his body, but it was a real body. You could touch it, he could have something to eat, it was a real body, and it was the same body. Because at one point he says, look at the marks. Put your finger where the marks were. The body that lived and the body that died and the body that rose was the same person. So as to being a myth, that just doesn't work.
And I think what I'd want to add to that is that the Bible is clear that Jesus is unique, and that's what we believe. Sometimes people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, and people have added that to it. No, the Bible is absolutely clear that Jesus is divine. If you don't realise that, you haven't paid attention to what it very clearly says. And equally, people will run the argument, they'll say, well, resurrections just don't happen. That's as far as we need to take it, because we know people don't rise from the dead. But what we believe is that Jesus was unique. The events of his life, his death, his resurrection, and so forth are unique in themselves. And if you make extraordinary claims about divinity, you've got to give extraordinary proof, which the resurrection is. But as we'll see, the resurrection is more than simply proof of who Jesus is. It's proof of everything he taught and of God's plans for all of us, which is something Paul will consider in much more detail later on.
You talk about proof, Clover. This is a huge claim that someone actually and really rose from the dead. What evidence do we have? What proof, perhaps from your legal background, would you want to present to us? So
there's an awful lot of evidence and big books have been written on this. There's one called The Case for Christ, written by a journalist who was a skeptic who looked into the evidence of the resurrection in all different ways, and you can get that on Amazon, and he actually becomes a Christian. He comes to believe it, having looked at the evidence. I've also got this book called The Case for the Resurrection by Gary Habermas. That's excellent. Now, again, these are thick tomes, and we can't cover all of this stuff this evening, but I wasn't a Christian until my late teens. And so what I've done is just pick 3 things that I believe. That's why I've picked these out. These were 3 things that I thought that I've since discovered are unsustainable and wrong. They contradict with clear evidence. And the first of those, I'd have just said, before I believed, that people back in the ancient world just believed anything. They just believed anything. Now, I'm too old to have read them, but my girls like the Percy Jackson stories. I'd have loved those growing up. I was more Ray Harryhausen and Sinbad and kind of little plasticine models and all that. Loved all that. And I'd have just said, look, this is the ancient world. People came up with these kind of wonderful stories, but we don't actually, no one really believes in Jason and the Argonauts. No one really believes in Thor and Zeus. Jesus is no different. It's a myth. And I'd have been very dismissive of that. The thing was in saying that, I was completely ignorant of the culture in which Christianity was born. This was a Jewish culture which rejected the existence of all of these gods and myths. It was very clear that there was only one God, strictly monotheistic. In that sense, it's almost the most unlikely culture for this to take root, and yet it did. And the ancients, as Paul said, weren't idiots. They were ancient, but they weren't idiots. Roman soldiers knew how to kill people. People knew that you didn't just rise from the dead. It was just ignorance on my part to say, people back then would have believed anything, which is why this came to be believed. And you read the gospel accounts, and it's very clear. Jesus' own followers didn't believe he was going to rise from the dead. They believed that once he was dead, that was the end of the story. It's very clear on that. On the first Easter Sunday, a number of women who knew Jesus went to his tomb to embalm him. Well, that means clearly they expected to find a dead body there. They weren't there going, well, he's definitely going to rise. He said he would, and getting out the deck chairs to watch. That's not what happened. And Thomas, famously doubting Thomas as he becomes known, just rightly skeptical Thomas, says, unless I see him, unless I touch him, of course I'm not going to believe this. And this is the ancient world in which these documents were recorded. I think the second thing that I would have said was that it's probably a late invention. The resurrection. What I mean is that, yes, there was this guy called Jesus. He taught some wonderful things. He was clearly a good guy, but he stood up against the authorities. He stood up against the traditionalists. He came a cropper under the Romans, and he died. And he said some wonderful things about love and other things. But then what's happened is, over the decades, over the centuries, people then layered on top of that this myth that he was somehow supernatural, that he was somehow divine, and that he rose from the dead. And what we need to do is separate all of that myth from the truth about Jesus and just look at him being a really good guy and see what we can learn from that. But again, what I realized as I looked at it was that, again, is not sustainable as a hypothesis. It's just not how things happen. Now, this is slightly complicated, but it's worth following through. AD 64 was the Great Fire of Rome. Emperor Nero is in power at the time. And as a result of that fire, he blamed Christians for starting it, and they were persecuted. And that means that in AD 64, there were an identifiable group of people in Rome, known as Christians, who were being persecuted because they affirmed that there was one king, King Jesus, who had risen from the dead and who they worshipped. Now, the point here is this is only 30 years after the time of Christ. Only 30 years. That's what happened. Christianity has traveled from ancient Israel to ancient Rome. In numbers, Christianity has become identified with the belief that Jesus is king and that he's risen from the dead and he's to be worshipped and he's the only true king. And that's what got them into trouble. And that's only a 30-year period for that to happen. And it's traveling. I think it's about 1,440 miles direct if you flew, but of course you couldn't. It's about 3,000 miles if you go around the coast to get between the two. That's rapid progress. That's Christianity, the belief in the resurrection spreading like wildfire. It simply is historically inaccurate and unsustainable to say this is something that simply can't. But I believed that because it was the kind of thing people said. But I hadn't looked at the evidence. And the final thing I'd say that I used to believe was that the Bible wasn't worth reading, didn't make any sense, that the Old Testament didn't hang together with the New. And I was very dismissive of it as a piece of evidence. But the more I've looked at it, the more I understood that actually the Old Testament is clear about the coming of Jesus. It speaks very clearly of what he would do when he came, written hundreds of years before him. And then when you look at the Gospels that account it, they don't read like myths, they read like history. Luke, who we're going to see a video, I think, later of part of what he wrote, very clearly said that he was going to interview the witnesses, that he'd gone through this, and actually when you read his account, it's full of details, names and places. It's credible, good evidence. Now, that doesn't mean it's not saying something that isn't extraordinary. But as we said, that's the point, that Jesus is unique, and we need to listen to him, and we need to trust in him. Now, I don't think those things answer every question that people have, and you may have many other questions, but those were some of the things that I realized when I looked at it for myself. I was on the wrong track, and actually it wasn't ridiculous. I didn't have to bend my mind to start believing in the truth of who Jesus is.
That's very good. My learned friend has really kind of taken us through a lot of the evidence there, hasn't he? I remember when I was at university, I had to study a number of books that were written on the evidence of the resurrection and so on, and understanding the resurrection. I had to read books from people who didn't believe. And one of them was a French theologian by the name of Ernst Renan. And Renan made this statement. He said, if I had been there on that first evening with the disciples, and if I had seen him with my own eyes, and if I had heard him speak, and if I had reached out my hand and touched him, I still would not believe he had risen from the dead. So you kind of read that and you think, well, what would convince you? And the answer is absolutely nothing, because we come to these kind of subjects with our own presuppositions. If your presupposition is that the world is closed, miracles can't happen, people don't rise from the dead, that's it. Of course, there's got to be another explanation. But if your presupposition is that there is a God, and God made the world, and God made a world with rules and laws and laws of nature, and occasionally, if he wants to make a real point, God can reverse the laws of nature, then you look again at what the evidence is, and the evidence is overwhelming. One of my professors, a man called Charlie Mole, who was responsible, he was the Regius Professor of Divinity, or the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University. He would begin his lectures on New Testament theology and ethics with these words: if Jesus Christ had not risen from the dead, there would be no New Testament theology and ethics. There would be no New Testament. There would be no church. The church has the resurrection written all over it. So I think if you take the cumulative evidence, you take all the evidence together, the empty tomb and the testimony of the apostles and the existence of the church and the transformation of the world by the person of Jesus, you put all that together, I have to say I would need more faith to believe Jesus had not risen from the dead than to believe that he had. So if you put all the evidence together that we just talked about, it just seems to me it's something that you at least need to look at, to consider. And there are many people who've done just that. They've come with, if you like, an open mind, saying, well, let's just take the evidence as it is, and they've come to the conclusion the only explanation is that it's real, it's true, it happened.
Great. We've had a couple of questions come through, which we'll turn to now. We're also going to look at questions a bit later on. But for now, you talk about the fact that Jesus really died and really rose. Not everyone believes, for example, Muslims and other faiths who see Jesus as a prophet don't believe that he died and rose. Now, why can we be sure that we've got it right, if you like, and those guys haven't?
Well, I think looking at the evidence, it is widely historically accepted by historians of all different stripes. You know, I can think of Jewish historians who would have a very different take on who Jesus actually is to the one that I have. I can think of highly skeptical historians who would say that it's entirely reasonable to believe that there was this man called Jesus, that he taught, he assembled groups of disciples within ancient Palestine, and that he was crucified under the direction of Pontius Pilate and the Romans. Now, of course, many of these people wouldn't add that he rose again, but those things are commonly accepted historical facts, and therefore to think that Jesus, didn't die, that he wasn't crucified, I think is unsustainable. It also, of course, goes against the evidence from the Bible, which I've said I think is good evidence. I think actually we need to look at the Bible and not simply say, well, it's biased. I'm not going to consider that, but to read it for what it is and to see how carefully, particularly, for example, Luke has written and recorded what happened for us. And so I think those things together give us a reasonable understanding of who Jesus is. It is reasonable to believe that he died, but also that he rose again.
Yeah, I mean, Islam accepts Jesus as a prophet. They don't believe that he died. I think they believe that Judas in some way was kind of spirited into his place. The Quran and Muslim beliefs are 5 centuries later. Luke is writing in the 1st century. Luke is not an eyewitness, but he's spoken to the eyewitnesses. He's spoken to eyewitnesses like Matthew and Mark, who've also written Gospels. Luke is an amazing historian. And you check out the historical credibility of the 2 books he wrote, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, and there are books on this that you can look at. They are incredibly accurate. So here's a man who does the research. He's not making it up. So we believe because the eyewitnesses tell us, and they were there. We're not. We weren't there.
I think I'd also want to add to that something which I think Paul touched on earlier, which is one of the reasons why some people, not everyone, but some people are skeptical of the resurrection, is simply because they think it is impossible to believe that anyone who was of God, even if they don't believe he was God, even if he was just a prophet, the idea that Jesus would have died in that way, they think is impossible to believe because it is such a terrible and such a shameful death. And on that basis, it's rejected, saying that God would never have done that. But as again we'll touch on in more detail later, the wonder is that Jesus did that for us. It was a death with a purpose that he chose to do, and only he could do that for us. And again, one of the reasons why that skepticism comes in is because people say, well, no one who is of God, certainly if he was God, who on earth, what kind of God would allow himself to be crucified? That seems ridiculous. And again, that's a misunderstanding of why Jesus came and why the crucifixion and the resurrection are so important.
Just quickly, we've got one more question. Some would say that the resurrection doesn't really matter because the main point of Jesus' life was surely to be an example, to show us how to live. How would you respond to that?
Well, a couple of things. One is, if all he's doing is pointing us the way and telling us this is the way to live, then that leaves me cold, because the way in which he lived and the teaching that he gave is beyond anything that I can ever aspire to. So, for example, he goes deep, doesn't he? He says it's not enough just not to be angry, not to murder. You mustn't be angry with people. You must love God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind. So if he's just a teacher, that doesn't help me at all. The second thing to say is just look at his teaching. Just read what he says. Yes, he teaches about God as Father. Yes, he teaches some wonderful moral codes. But he also, if I can use this word, was incredibly egotistical. He pointed constantly at himself. If I was to say to you tonight, your eternal destiny depends whether you go to heaven or hell on what your response to me is. You listen to me, you do exactly what I tell you, and if you do what I tell you, you'll go to heaven. And if you deny me and reject me, it's the same as rejecting God. If I was to say to you tonight, if you want to know exactly what God is like, look at my life and you will see exactly what God is like. In fact, me and God are in such a close relationship, you look at me and you see God. If I was to say those things, you'd think, the old man's gone balmy. He needs locking up. He's crazy. But, that's exactly what Jesus said. That's part of the reason they crucified him. They hated it. They picked up stones to stone him because they knew what he was saying. So the idea that he's standing there and he's saying, I just want to show you how to live and it's going to be a nice moral code, that's just nonsense. Jesus pointed to himself and he said, look, I've come from God to show you what God is like, to be God amongst you, to die on a cross because your debt to God is so great you can't pay it, but I can and I will. and to die on the cross in our place, and then to rise again. And the resurrection simply says what he said is true. If he'd not risen from the dead, then he'd have been forgotten, and everything that he'd said would have said, well, he's just crazy, he's just a madman. The fact that he rose from the dead is God saying, listen to this man, he is true, you can trust him.
Great. We'll take some more questions a little bit later on, but for now we're going to take a quick break before Lexi joins us. While we're taking that break, we're going to watch a video which helps us fit the resurrection of Jesus into the rest of his life, and this is from Luke's eyewitness account.
We've been looking at the story of Jesus as it's told in Luke's gospel. It begins with the arrival of an unlikely king born in poor, humble circumstances.
Then we saw Jesus as a teacher and prophet. He went throughout Israel calling people to a radical way of life, where enemies become friends, the poor are cared for, where people find forgiveness for their failures.
He went from town to town inviting people to follow him and live under God's reign in this upside-down way.
And he did many signs and wonders, so many Israelites began to hope that he would rescue Israel from the Romans and set up a new kingdom of peace and justice. In short, that he would bring the kingdom of God.
Now, the religious leaders of the day were also hoping for God's kingdom, but to them, the message of Jesus was a threat.
Yeah, they had expected to gain power and prestige when this all went down. But Jesus said God's kingdom belongs to the poor, to the outsider, and that real power is serving others in love.
This conflict intensified when Jesus, while in Jerusalem, disrupted the temple sacrifices and called Israel's leaders a gang of rebels.
So they arrested Jesus, and they had him accused before the Roman authorities of being a rebel king. He was handed over for execution, even though he was innocent. Then he was taken outside the city and put to death on false charges.
This brings us to the final section of the Gospel of Luke. There was a religious leader named Joseph who opposed Jesus' execution and then requested to be given his body so he could bury Jesus in a nearby tomb.
And then, a couple of days later, some women who had followed Jesus came to visit that tomb, and they found it open and empty, and they encountered these mysterious figures telling them Jesus was alive from the dead. So they run away terrified. Nobody believes their report. I mean, he can't be alive. They all saw him die.
Now, just outside of Jerusalem, a pair of Jesus' followers were leaving the city, traveling on a road to a town called Emmaus, and they were sad and confused about everything that had happened.
Then Jesus shows up, walking alongside them, but they don't know it's him.
Yeah, that's weird. Why couldn't they recognize him?
Yeah, it's an odd but really significant image for Luke. They're blind to Jesus for some reason, so Jesus asks them, "What are you guys talking about?"
And they begin to tell him about Jesus, a powerful prophet who they expected would rescue Israel, but was instead executed. Some women say he's alive, which is crazy. It's all too much. We're going home.
So Jesus tries to explain that this is what the Jewish scriptures had been pointing to all along, that Israel needed a king who would suffer and die as a rebel on behalf of those who actually are rebels. And then he would be vindicated by his resurrection so he could give true life to those who would receive it.
But it's still not making sense. They're as confused as ever.
Which leads to the scene where they sit down for a meal with Jesus. He takes the bread, he blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them, just as he did at the Last Supper.
Yeah, this is the image of his broken body, his death on the cross.
And it's when they take in the broken bread, that's when their eyes are open to see Jesus. Then he disappears, and the episode's over.
So this is a story about how it's hard to see Jesus for who he really is.
Yes, this is brilliant. I mean, how could God's royal power and love be revealed through this man's shameful execution? How could a humble man become the king of the world through weakness and self-sacrifice? It's very hard to see. But this is the message of the Gospel of Luke. It takes a transformation of your imagination to see it and embrace Jesus' upside-down kingdom.
The Gospel of Luke ends with Jesus and all of his disciples together over another meal. And everyone's freaking out about his resurrected body. I mean, he's still a human, but way more.
Yes, he's passed through death and come out the other side, a walking, talking piece of new creation. And then Jesus tells them that he's going to give them the same divine power that sustained him, so they can go out and share the good news of God's kingdom with other people.
After this, Luke tells us that Jesus was taken up into heaven. which is a cool exit and all, but why disappear into the sky?
So in the Old Testament, the skies are the place of God's throne. They're above everything. So this is Luke's way of showing that Jesus has been enthroned as the divine king of the whole world.
His followers stay in Jerusalem, worshiping God and Jesus, waiting for this new power, and this is where the gospel ends.
Now, Luke is going to write about how they receive this power and take the news out into the world, and that's what his second volume, the book of Acts, is all about.
Great, well, welcome back. One of the big claims about the resurrection is that it totally transforms our life today. It has huge significance. And ultimately, it's the foundation to the answer to the question we're asking tonight: is there hope beyond the grave? So as we explore that now, I'd like to welcome Lexi to the panel. Lexi, could you just introduce yourself to us and maybe tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lexi. I originally came to Bath for university. I met my lovely husband and we have 2 boys. For work, I work as a cognitive behaviour therapist with people who have mental health problems. And also in the last few months, I also started working here as a pastoral worker.
If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked Paul and Clover. Do you believe in an actual, real Jesus?
Yes.
Do you believe that he actually really died on a cross?
Yes, I really do.
And do you believe he physically and really rose again?
Yes.
Great. Paul and
It's
Lexi.
a good job, really. I mean, having employed her, we did want to make sure she got those questions right. Well done.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
We're going to now think about that question, beating death, is there any hope beyond the grave? And how the resurrection makes a huge difference to the here and now of life. I know both of you spend a lot of time speaking to people about their lives, about the experiences they tackle kind of in the day-to-day. So first of all, just how does the resurrection change our lives today?
Shall I kick off?
Mm.
When I was thinking about this, I thought of 2 different ways that it changes our lives today. The first one is that if the resurrection is true, then it means that Jesus is alive. As it said in the video, he is raised to heaven and is reigning there now. So that means that we can know him personally for ourselves, because he's alive today and we can talk to him and hear from him.
Yeah, just add to that. We're not talking about an influence. It's not the influence of Jesus, and it lives on in his influence. Like, people say Elvis is still alive. Of course, some people actually think he is, but what they mean is his music, his influence, his, whatever Elvis was. No, we're not. We're talking about a personal relationship, just as we can have a personal relationship with someone else. So I can have a relationship with my wife. I can have a relationship with my friends, with my kids. It's a personal relationship. I can't see Jesus with my physical eyes, but I can have a personal relationship with a person who is alive. He promised to be with us by the power of the Holy Spirit. At the end of that was that a video or a DVD? What was that called? What do I call it?
Video, Paul.
It was a video. At the end of that video, he said he wrote another book, which of course is the Acts of the Apostles. And what happens in the Acts of the Apostles is that in the person of the Holy Spirit, God actually comes to live within the church and to have a personal relationship with us. So if he's alive, I can know him. And actually that's the purpose of my life, to know God. It's not a vague sort of mystical thing. It's a real relationship with God.
Yeah. And the other implication I was thinking about is that if Jesus rose from the dead, then we too can trust him that we will be raised from the dead. If we trust in him, that is his promise. So that means that this life is not all there is, that there is hope beyond the grave.
Yeah, I shall say a little bit more about hope. I'm going to do a brief epilogue before we finish in a little while. And I just want to speak about hope. And all of us need hope. It's a very famous book written about Auschwitz concentration camp and about those who survived. And one of the men who survived through all the horrors of Auschwitz said that the difference he saw between those who kept going and those who just gave up, the difference was hope. Some people believed there is light at the end of the tunnel. We'll get through this. Now, of course, for millions, that hope was snuffed out. But for those who survived, those who didn't just give up and sit down and say, that's it, and just stop living, as it were, the people who survived because they saw that there was hope. And we all need hope. That's part and parcel of what we are as human beings. And the resurrection gives us hope.
I know the last year, I think for many people, has really thrown into relief the fragility of life, the struggles of life, whether it be our physical health or the effects the pandemic has had on mental health. And perhaps we've realized that struggles can sort of come out of nowhere. So does the resurrection of Jesus help us with the struggles we might face day to day?
I think one of the ways that it can help us is this last year has shown how, you use the word fragile some of the things are that we can build our life on and trust in and rely on day to day. So being able to see our family and having support from them, or having financial income, or good health, all these things have been brought into question in this last year. But with the fact of the resurrection, that is something that is sure and solid and can't be changed. So when everything else around us is changing, we can rest on the truth of Jesus' death and resurrection and who he says he is.
That's really helpful, Lexi, I think. I just a couple of things about that. First thing is, one of the things that troubles us more than anything else, I suppose, is when we're conscious that we do things that are wrong, that sort of guilty conscience. And it's amazing how that's thrown up in the current circumstances. When life is uncertain, we trouble over that. And so although we're talking tonight about the resurrection, I think we've already hinted that the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus go together. You can't separate them. The death of Jesus is for a purpose. It's to deal with the things that we have done wrong, the things that are a barrier between me and God, which I can't do anything about, my guilt, my bad record. The death of Jesus on the cross deals with those things. How can I be sure? How can I be certain? Because Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus' resurrection is God saying, yes, I accept the sacrifice. You can have a relationship with me. And now you can build your life on a solid foundation. As Lexi says, in the midst of all the kind of sweeping time, change, etc., we have something solid. We have the promises of God. So Jesus, for example, says, come to me if you're weary and weighed down with life. I will give you rest. Can you imagine rest? In a world like this, I don't mean sleep, I mean just peace of mind. Come to me, I will give you peace of mind. So if Jesus rose from the dead, all of those things are true, and there is a foundation, a solid foundation, as Lexi says.
Lexi, just a moment ago, I think you mentioned that the resurrection of Jesus gives us certainty of eternal life. I just wanted to ask a bit more about that. How is it that the resurrection of Jesus gives us certainty beyond the grave?
Do you want me, or shall I go first? Okay. The resurrection of Jesus is described in the Bible as the first fruits, or the paradigm of resurrection. By which I mean, if you walk along the road now, you'll see the daffodils. And I took my wife for a walk this afternoon, and we saw the other flowers, the snowdrops. That's it, isn't it? Yeah, snowdrops. Thank you, girls. And it shows you that spring is on the way. They are the kind of the forerunners. They are the first fruits. They are the sign spring is coming. And Jesus' resurrection is a kind of a foretaste for us. What Jesus said is, if I rose from the dead, you will rise also. And you will rise in the kind of body that I will rise in. We're not airy-fairy here. Jesus' body was the real body. It was the same body. It was a transformed body. And he said, if it happened to me, it's going to happen to you. So my belief in the resurrection isn't just as a neat historical fact. It's something that gives me hope beyond the grave, because death is not the end. Death is not the end. If Jesus rose, then God can bring me and the people that I love back from the dead. And so the resurrection changes the whole view of death.
Can I just give a personal example to illustrate the way that gives comfort? So I don't know if you know, but today is National Rare Diseases Day. And myself and the boys have, a rare disease. And actually our youngest was born with 2 rare diseases. And when he was 2, he needed quite a big operation. And I remember the night before the operation, looking at his skin and seeing how the skin of a young child, which is kind of soft and unblemished and smooth, and just thinking, from tomorrow he's going to have a whopping scar for the rest of his life. And that was, I guess as a mother, that's quite a sad moment. But then another thought came in that actually, if he trusts in Jesus, then he will be resurrected in a new body that will be perfected and alive and won't carry a scar at all. It's just a small example, but it shows the way that hope can give us comfort in the things that we face in life.
We've spent quite a lot of tonight talking about the issue of death. Now I know that's a very sensitive issue for many people. I thought it worth asking, as we come towards a close, is there any help that you can give tonight for those who are facing loss or grief at the moment?
Well, I guess we have been talking about the hope that Jesus' resurrection gives, but I also don't want to give a glib answer. The way people have described grief to me is like a physical searing pain, so I don't want to minimize that, but Jesus is described in the Bible as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And I just would say that if you are acquainted with grief tonight, I would encourage you to talk to him through prayer. Just tell him what's on your heart. And also to look at the Bible, maybe look at the book of Luke, and look at the way that Jesus treats people who are hurting, and see how he cares for us.
Yeah, I mean, very moving when you're talking about your little boy a while ago, and the hope is that for all of us, that beyond the grave there is a new resurrection body, and Jesus had a new resurrection body, but actually it appears that even in that resurrection body he bore the scars. I think that's unique to Jesus, because the scars are the marks of his love, and they are the marks of his sympathy. And Lex is right. Over the years I've had to deal with people who have lost loved ones. Grief is the most intense pain. Someone's described it as it's like pulling the flesh off the bones. It's an intense pain. And yet the knowledge that Christ understands. Just down the road from here is Bristol. And one of the famous sons of Bristol was George Muller, if you come across Muller Homes. And when he spoke at the funeral of his wife who died, Muller said, there are 3 comforts that I find now. Number 1, my wife is not lost. She's with Jesus. She is with him. Number 2, Jesus is with me. And number 3, my wife and I will meet Jesus one day on resurrection morning. When Jesus comes again, he will raise her, he will raise me, and we will see one another. But more than that, we will see him. Now that may sound kind of crazy, weird. And yet all of that is founded on the reality of the resurrection, the physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Thank you. I think we're going to take a few questions that have come in now. A few quick fire ones maybe.
Okay.
We've had a few come in. You use I think Clovis spoke about the spread of Christianity as proof that the resurrection of Jesus is credible. Could that argument not also be used about the fast spread of other religions across the world?
There's no religion that is quite the same as Christianity that actually is based on preaching about a crucified and risen person. Islam and Muhammad rode into Mecca at the head of an army, and you became a Muslim by force. Christians were thrown to the lions, they were burnt at the stake, they were persecuted, they were murdered, and yet they just kept going. Now, yes, both religions spread very quickly. Look at what their message was. Look at how they did. That in itself is not the final proof of the resurrection, but just look at the credibility of one compared with the credibility of the other, and you can compare with other religions as well.
Okay, we've got another one. The Gospel accounts and the book of Acts detail that Jesus ascended fairly soon after he was supposedly resurrected. Isn't that just a convenient fact to get around this whole issue?
The whole story is to do with Jesus coming from heaven and returning to heaven. And the point is that to go back to heaven is to complete the job, because the job becomes a reality when the Holy Spirit comes to the church on the day of Pentecost. On the day of Pentecost, Peter, who'd been terrified, stands up and says, look, here is the evidence. God is now amongst us. It's kind of this opening of the floodgates, and this message is going to flood out from Jerusalem. 3,000 converted one day. A little bit later, the 5,000. Then it's on and on and on. And by the end of Acts, which is only 30 years, it's to the ends of the earth. Why did that happen? Because that power's released when Jesus rose from the dead. And actually, Peter doesn't say, listen, guys, you don't have to believe this. We made it up because we can't show you the body because he's up in heaven now. What Peter says is, look at what you can see with your own eyes. What you see is the evidence of the church expanding and growing, is the evidence that Jesus is risen. So it's all part of one story, one big story that all fits together.
I've got one more question about kind of documentary evidence. It's not exactly related to the resurrection, but it's an important question. Someone writes, how can we trust that the book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation are true when the authors seem to be unknown?
Well, I don't think the book of Revelation is unknown. It's pretty clear to me that it's written by John, who was the apostle. He identifies himself as John. The book of Hebrews, we don't know the author. From a very early age, the church recognized that it had apostolic credentials, by which we mean that Jesus called the apostles to be his witnesses. He gave the message like a baton into their hands, and so the apostles tested whether something was authentic or it wasn't. And so not every book in the New Testament, 27 books in the New Testament, not every one was written by an apostle. So, for example, James was not one of the 12 apostles, neither was Luke, and yet they're authenticated by the apostles. And when the church came to look at the Bible and they say which are the books that are authentic and real and reliable, it wasn't that the church made it up and said those are the books. What the church did was just to discover what actually was authentic and real. It wasn't the church defined what was real. It simply listened to what was real and said, this is it.
Great, thanks, Paul. I guess it's hopefully been fairly obvious what we're talking about tonight is not just theoretical. Paul, I know that for you, this has had an impact in your life in recent months. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, okay. And we've talked a lot about the Bible tonight, so let me read to you just one verse from the Bible. This is from a letter by a man called Peter. We've mentioned Peter a couple of times already. Peter was an eyewitness of the resurrection. He was a disciple of Jesus. His life was changed by the resurrection of Jesus. He's writing to a group of Christians who are facing the real possibility of death. Clover mentioned earlier Nero and the Neronian persecutions. Thousands of Christians were burnt at the stake, thrown to the lions. Peter is writing to Christians who probably are on the eve of that. And this is what he writes. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. I don't know whether you remember last summer when we were out of lockdown and life seemed kind of normal. We were all going around in masks, but kind of getting there. Well, on August the 1st, my wife and I were really excited because we had planned to have our five of our 8 grandchildren to come and stay with us for the first time. Can you imagine that? We were excited. Their parents were ecstatic. So the kids were going to come and stay with us. And so I went down into Bath early in the morning, really excited. I went to buy provisions, snacks, midnight snacks and top trumps and all sorts of things to keep the kids excited. 1st of August, got back home, and the moment I walked through the door, I knew there was something not right. My wife said, "You better sit down. Your sister has just rung, and your mum died early this morning." I don't think it was COVID related. My mum was in her mid-90s. She'd been frail for a long time, been in care for a long time, and actually for the last few years, really, she hasn't known who I was. She had Alzheimer's and really didn't recognize me. And in a sense, it was sad, it was tragic. In another sense, I'd done a lot of my grieving a long time before, and I knew that my mum was with Jesus. She'd gone to heaven. She'd been taken into his presence. She was a Christian. But having said that, it's pretty tough losing your mum, isn't it? I can remember as a little boy, all the way up until I was a big man, she would always say, first time I saw her, "How you doing, duck?" And that's nothing to do with the fact that I'm called Mallard. It's just of a brummy, "How you doing, duck? Are you okay?" And I would not hear those words again. I stood at the graveside. I conducted the funeral, and I stood at the graveside. I've stood at scores of graves. And you kind of think, is that it? Is that it? This person who's been so real to you, who's been such a big person in your life, they're gone. Is that it? And I don't think that's an unreasonable question to ask. And I don't think it's necessarily a Christian question or a religious question. It's a kind of a human question. We kind of scream in the face of death, is that it? This person who's meant so much to me and are now gone, is that it? And Peter is speaking to that situation, and he's speaking about this word hope. God has given us a living hope. Now the problem is we kind of think of hope as a sort of a last resort. When you've got nowhere else to go, you talk about hope. It's kind of fingers crossed maybe. That's not the way in which the Bible uses it. It's certainly not the way in which Peter uses it. When Peter uses the word hope, what he means is absolute, unstoppable, inescapable, unconditional certainty. We have an absolute certainty. And that certainty is based, on 3 things, according to Peter here. Number 1, it's based on the mercy of God. Let me read it to you again. In his great mercy, God has given us a living hope. And it's interesting, he begins there. See, hope isn't something that we earn. It's not something we deserve. It's not something that we work for. Hope is a gift of God based on the mercy of God. Remember I said earlier, 2 things fit together, always in the New Testament. 2 things were central to this growth of the church, the cross and the resurrection. You can't separate them. And the one is as necessary as the other. Why? Because all of us, when we look back over our lives, are very conscious that there are things that we've done that we should not have done. I'm not just talking about regrets or mistakes or errors of judgment. I'm talking about things that we're ashamed of. In a previous church, I was in Worcester, and I used to visit a hospice fairly regularly. I remember a conversation with one man who, the moment I sat down next to his bed, he said, "Look, I'm not a Christian or anything, but can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Of course you can." "What happens after death?" he said. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "I'm not afraid of dying. We're all got to die. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm terrified of what happens next. Because I know that I've done things I shouldn't do, and I've got to stand before God." That was quite a remarkable statement, wasn't it? If we're honest, we've all had a record in the past of things we shouldn't have done. Things when we've been unkind or unfaithful and untruthful or self-centered. We've done things and we know we shouldn't have done them, but we've done them anyway, either because of cowardice or because of pride or because of selfishness. We've got a stain, and it's not just things that we've done, it's things that we've said. Sometimes we've used words like hatchets to tear people apart. And very often the things that we regret most, the things that we're most ashamed of, are the things that we've done to the people that we love the most. We've got a stain. How can I stand before God who sees everything? And here's the answer: because of the great mercy of God. Hope begins when we grasp the truth that God is a God who has mercy. It's a wonderful verse in the Bible which says God is slow to anger and abundant in mercy. We often think of God the other way around. We think of God as being a bit mean and always looking for an opportunity to zap us. The moment you step out of line, bang, God will get you. God is slow to mercy and he's abundant in anger. Nothing could be further than the truth. Yes, God gets angry with things that are wrong. How could he not do if he's God and he's pure and he's right and truth and goodness and purity matter? How could he not get angry with things that are wrong? But he's slow to anger. He's abundant in mercy. Peter, who wrote this book, did lots of things that were wrong. In the darkest moment, when Jesus needed him most, he denied Jesus. And yet Jesus met him, and Peter tasted the mercy of God. And the resurrection really gives us hope and the future, because it kind of proves that God is merciful. God accepts the forgiveness or accepts the sacrifice Jesus made. I want you tonight to think about that. But before you leave tonight, before you turn the TV off or whatever you're watching this on, just think, am I ready to meet God? Have I experienced the mercy of God? Second thing he says here, he's given us hope, great living hope, by the great mercy of God and the new birth. That sounds a little bit strange, doesn't it? New birth. What are we talking about when we talk about new birth? Well, you think of a newborn child. I had the great privilege of holding my 4 children when they were just not hours old, minutes old. You know, you hold them in their arms, this little squalling cosmos. And they, you know, have you ever smelt a newborn baby? You know, you just smell them. It's kind of very invigorating. I mean, I get the idea that the more you smell, the more. You know, well, anyway, it's just wonderful. The beginning of life, something fresh, something new, a new start, and that's part of the imagery that he's using here. A new birth, a new beginning. God gives us a new start. God changes us inside. Remember we said earlier, Christianity is not a matter about rules. Christianity is all about personal relationship. We can know God because Jesus comes to bring us to God, and he shows us God, and he brings us into a relationship with God, so that hope is not something on the outside, it's something on the inside. We have a new life, we have a new start. Christianity is not me pulling myself up by my bootstraps. It's not me turning over a new leaf. It's not me saying, well, from now onwards, I'm going to work really hard so that when I die, I'm ready to meet God. No, it's God changing me inside. It's like a man who's been blind. He's been born blind, and he's never seen colours in his life. He's never seen the faces of the people that he loves, and he can taste. He's tasted beautiful food, and he's smelt wonderful smells, and he's felt the wind on his face, but he's never seen. And then suddenly his sight is restored, and he looks into the face of the person that he loves most in all the world, and he sees a sunset, and he sees colours, and he sees textures. Suddenly he's alive. And hope is like that. It's a new beginning. It's a new start. It's like coming out of a prison into the daylight. Hope is based on this new powerful work of God. Jesus rose from the dead. He sent the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit changes us on the inside. Living hope is based on the mercy of God. It's based on this new birth. And then, of course, what we've been talking about for the whole evening, based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That's the clincher. Without that, it's all a fairy story. Without that, it's all wishful thinking. Without that, it really is just Fingers crossed. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then as C.S. Lewis says, he pushed open a door that's been shut from the beginning of time. Everything is different now because Jesus rose from the dead. He's the beginning of the resurrection. There are more resurrections to come. There's future hope. Peter was transformed by it. Peter, 1 minute, is denying Jesus. He's so terrified. He's so afraid of death. Just 7 weeks later, he's standing up in the city of Jerusalem and he's saying, look, let me tell you, Jesus was a real man. He died on a cross. You killed him. God raised him from the dead. We saw it. Now believe. He's completely transformed. His fears are gone because he knows it's true. And these men, the men who he's writing to here, many of the men who wrote those books in the New Testament died for their faith. As Clover said, they were willing to die because they knew it was true. And we have hope for the future because Jesus rose from the dead. It's not airy-fairy, it's not bizarre. Although, if you're thinking about it for the first time, it may sound bizarre. It's not kind of a, I'll see the spirit of that person. No, Jesus rose physically, and the Christian hope is not the immortality of the soul, it is the resurrection of the body. The dead in Christ will rise. So one day on resurrection morning, I will see my mum again. And she will say to me, "Hello, Duck. How are you?" And I will say, "I am better than I have ever been in all my life." And so will she. That's the hope that we have as Christians. And it all centers on the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those words. And thank you to our panel. Thank you, Lexi, and thank you, Clover. If you're out there and you've got more questions, you want to find out more, at the end there'll be an email address you can email, or just text that same number again, and we'll be in touch with you if you would like some resources, or if you've just got more questions, we can answer those for you. I want to say thank you very much for joining us tonight, whether you've been here in the building or there at home, and we really hope this has been a help to you. Thank you very much.